Good morning. I think we're going to get started. No sense penalizing you who have arrived on time and making you wait for those who will come late. So I want to welcome everybody on behalf of the organizers to our conference on police reform in Mexico, challenges and opportunities to strengthen law enforcement. My name is Eric Olson, and I'm the Senior Advisor for Security Policy here at the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I also want to recognize Andrew Seeley, who's the Director of the Mexico Institute, and then our co-organizers for this event, Maureen Myers, who will, from the Washington Office on Latin America, who will moderate this panel and help coordinate questions and so on at the end. And also Jenny Johnson from the Latin America Working Group. Thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this. And also want to welcome a number of special guests here who are experts on the topic as well and will provide some commentary at the end. First of all, I would like to recognize ex-Governor Lázaro Cárdenas, who was a visiting fellow here at the center last semester and is back again here in Washington participating with numerous groups. A lot of experience in local police issues, so I'm hoping if he can be here till the end, will chime in some. And then also David Shirk from the University of California, San Diego, also an expert on policing issues. We've chosen to examine the topic today of looking at the issue of local policing because it's often overlooked in discussions about crime and violence in Mexico. We know a lot about what's going on in Mexico related to crime and violence. Violence from organized crime and conflicts within and between and amongst drug trafficking organizations is horrifying, it's gruesome, it's plastered on the front pages of the newspapers in Mexico and here in the United States. And we also know that Mexico has done a lot in the last couple years to create a federal police force, for the first time really a unified federal police force that is much better in terms of its training, the salaries it pays its police, it's better at vetting, and it's better because it has more resources from the federal government. The federal police aren't perfect, of course. There's still a lot of things to be dealt with, but they're a work in progress, and there are some signs of hope at that level. But we also know that 94%, and depending on who you ask, it may be 95 or 93, but 94% roughly of all crime in Mexico is actually crime against property. And that makes it crime from the local jurisdiction, what in Mexico is often referred to as the fuero común. We also know that of the estimated 350 to 400,000 police in Mexico, roughly 30 to 35,000 are federal police. So if we're going to think about this as logically, it makes sense that we would focus some, more, all of our attention to some extent at the local level. What is the nature, what is the needs, what are the challenges faced by the vast majority of Mexico's police forces, and what do we need to do or what needs to happen to see those local, municipal, state-level police forces professionalized, strengthened. That, in the end, is one of the major challenges that's not really being examined, I think, by policymakers here in the United States, and is certainly not getting the attention that all the gruesomeness is getting in the press. So we thought it was timely and important to call together a panel of experts who have dedicated a lot of their research and time to looking at the question of local, municipal, and state police. I should say, sometimes I use local and municipal interchangeably. Technically speaking, in Mexico, they're either state, federal, or municipal police. So I apologize if I confuse the issue. Anyway, I want to just introduce very briefly our distinguished panelist. They shuffled the order of presentation, so my notes are out of order here. But let me just start by introducing Professor David Sabet. He's a visiting professor at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, and he's going to talk to us about the obstacles to police professionalization at the local level. He's done enormous research amongst municipal police forces in Mexico, and so he will address that issue. Then, if I'm correct, we will be followed by Juan Salgado. Juan Salgado is an associate professor at the Center for Economic Research and Education, known as CIDE, in Mexico City. He will focus on accountability mechanisms, sometimes called internal and external control mechanisms, how they functioned, how they've not functioned, what's worked, what hasn't worked at the municipal level. He comes from a human rights background, so he has the perspective of accountability in his research and what he will discuss today. He will also look at the question of infiltration and penetration of organized crime in municipal police. And lastly, but certainly not least, Edgar Moar, who is the former Secretary of Citizen Security in the Querétaro state government. He brings to it that experience at the local level again, and he will look specifically at how federal attempts to help and support professionalization at the state and local level have fared, whether they've been helpful or not helpful. So we have a very good panel. We're going to, I'm going to invite Maureen up here to the front. She's going to moderate this panel. And thank you all for your presence and interest in this very timely issue.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, the Mexico Institute, for co-sponsoring this with WOLA and LOG. And I think without any more ado, certainly start with the presentation. So, Daniel, go ahead.
Great. Thank you all very much. Thank you to the Wilson Center, to LOG, and to WOLA for the invitation, and for you all for being here. I want to talk about some of the results, initial results from a research project I've been working on for the last 2 years. It's a comparative case study looking at 4 municipalities, really in depth in terms of what they're doing in police reform in northwest Mexico: Tijuana, Mexicali, Hermosillo, and Chihuahua, and then some broader look at some other departments throughout of the major municipal police departments throughout the country. First off, I suppose the important thing to mention is it's nice to think, well, the military is taking care of this and we really don't need to worry about municipal police force, but of course that's not really the case, because the military obviously problems with human rights violations, really too blunt an instrument to do police work against organized crime and day-to-day crime problems. And then kind of if you don't buy those two, then really the military's job would be a lot harder if they're also not only having to fight organized crime, but also a corrupt municipal police force. It's important to note that there are a lot of very good reform processes that are in place and operating. Now, it's not to say that these are perfect. They have lots of problems, and we could talk about any of these things mentioned up here pretty extensively for both their strengths and weaknesses. But a few of them, just to mention very briefly, the Subsamun, this is the municipal subsidy program from the federal government, $300 million appropriated for 2009. Now, not all of that is likely to be distributed, but appropriated for purchasing infrastructure, or improving infrastructure, purchasing equipment, professionalization. And the interesting thing about the Subsamun program is it requires, they're conditional grants. So to get the money, the municipalities have to pony up some 25%, which is to be used for to improve police remuneration. That's a tough word for me, sorry. And then meet a series of other requirements. Now, there's some problems with that, but as far as it's the exact kind of role that the federal government really should be playing in creating financial incentives for municipalities to reform. As part of Subsamun and as part of other things, there's a large emphasis on vetting. By my count, it looks like in the last 2 years there's over 100,000 tests, what they call control de confianza tests, or integrity contrast. These include psychological testing, they include police knowledge, they include lie detector tests, which is the most kind of famous part of it, I suppose, asset declarations, background checks. Very limited tool with a lot of problems that I could talk more about, but an important step forward nonetheless. Police civil service, this is something a little more on paper than in reality, but at least the design of how a police civil service would look is out there for discussion. A lot of standardization and information sharing. This is the Plataforma Mexico, which is not only a tool to share crime information across departments, but also a police registry of, in theory, a police department, if they were to hire somebody, they could look and see if they'd been a police officer in a past life, in a previous municipality, and if they'd been fired for some reason. So that's an important advance there. Legal reforms, a lot of constitutional changes and legal changes that are significant. Most importantly, I think what the legal reforms have allowed to do is they've allowed Mexico to set national policy that affects the states and municipalities. Rather than everybody doing their own thing, you have a much more coherent national policy in the direction that municipal and state police forces are supposed to be going in. The national agreement, security, justice, and the rule of law or culture of lawfulness is important. That was August of 2008, and while it's not legal like the legal reforms, it's the consensus building. I kind of have it sectioned somewhat differently on here. If these are all kind of top-down things, and to some extent these are a little more bottom-up, not necessarily, but the national agreement represents a consensus effort between municipalities, states, and the federal government. CALEA, this is the Commission on Accreditation of Law Enforcement Agencies. Chihuahua gained some notoriety, the municipality of Chihuahua, because they were the first to achieve accreditation, which means they had completed 450 some standards, international standards, had developed procedures for these standards, and passed audits that said that they were in fact carrying these out. Significant advance. I can give lots of great examples of why CALEA is important. Kind of the easiest one for me to explain very briefly is when somebody is detained. Used to be you could be detained, thrown in the back of a pickup truck, handcuffed. That's not very good. CALEA certification means you can't do that anymore. When they would come to be processed, they would have to surrender their goods and be put in jail. CALEA requires that the employee there at the jail, the police officer, and the detainee all be there to observe what goods are put in a bag. Everybody has to sign a list of inventory of what goes in the bag, so it kind of reduces incentives for corruption. Then, once they go to the jail cells, have to be separate jail cells for males, for females, for minors. There has to be bathroom facilities. There has to be food, and there are video cameras as well on the cells. So, kind of important things there. And the judicial reforms, which are now kind of top-down, but originally emerged as bottom-up, will have an important impact on policing. If the image was of a police force that had primary and secondary school, didn't have good or really any academy training as cadets, and didn't receive then any in-service training later on throughout their careers, that image is changing, and this is something important that I think does need to be recognized. This is a few departments that responded to a survey that I developed. So these are the major departments in the country, and it's very important to note that this is not representative by any stretch of the imagination. These are the best departments. But you can see a lot of them do require high school degrees now to become police officers. That's a significant break from the past. The percent of officers that have a high school degree has risen. It's not maybe where we'd like it to be, but still worth mentioning. And then a lot of departments reporting that their police do receive annual in-service trainings. Now, there's good news and bad news here. The good news is if you ask them when they started this, which I did in the survey, most of these required high school degree really in the last 2, 3, 1 years. So very, very recent. And also, if you ask them when they started doing annual in-service training, last 2, 3 years or so. Now, you could look at that as a good thing or as a bad thing. As a good thing, it's, wow, this is maybe some change that's moving forward. As a bad thing, it means these kinds of initiatives really are not consolidated and really not institutionalized and could be implemented very poorly and could change with the change of administration. Okay. Also, the image of the police as horrendously paid, still not well paid, but I have these in pesos just because it used to be 10 to 1, now it's 14 to 1. So much of the gains in pay don't really exist if you if you translate the peso into dollar anymore, unfortunately. But kind of the norm used to be about 5,000, and as you can see, it's gone up from there. So this is monthly salary in pesos. Here, this is the subsimun, this is the municipal subsidy as a percent of the municipal budget. Municipal departments were paying 75, 80%, 70% to nomina, to their salaries, which didn't allow them very much to invest in infrastructure and in equipment. And what you can see Subsimun has done here in several cases, kind of on average, has increased police salary by some 25, 30%, and that can be used for equipment purchases, so and for improving infrastructure and these kinds of other things. So very kind of significant advance. So that's kind of a lot of the good news. The bad news is in the area of accountability and in a few other areas. There are lots of accountability mechanisms that could be very effective. You have vetting, which I mentioned. There's human rights commissions. There's ComStat in some departments. There's citizen services or citizen attention offices, internal affairs department. All these places where citizens can go make complaints. In theory, they're investigated. But you end up with lots of accountability mechanisms and very little accountability. There's a lot of variety of reasons why that is. The investigations tend to be reactive. They tend to be focused on individual officers and individual incidents. They're not proactive investigations. Let's target this officer and see if, in fact, they're conduct a long investigation to see if that person is involved in acts that violate their contract as police officers. They address very few cases of corruption. Most of them are citizen complaints of abuse-type issues and not so much corruption, and all of them don't touch the issue of organized crime in my 4 cities that I'm looking at. They report no complaints from fellow officers, and this, I think, is a kind of a significant indicator of if an internal affairs department is effective or not. If a police officer would feel confident enough to denounce or to file a complaint against a fellow officer, and that's not happening. And really the approach is focused on rotten apples and individuals and not on what's creating the incentives for police corruption. So this is kind of an unfortunate weakness. Some other weaknesses here: uneven advances between rural and urban areas. These are where you see these significant advances, as I put on the slides earlier. These are major urban departments, and so you go to some of the rural police departments, and really things have not changed at all. Accountability mechanisms, merit-based promotion is a huge one that has not moved forward, and then transparency and civil society oversight. So these are kind of the big weaknesses. The question that is kind of central to my research is why good policies don't work. So you have these policies in place, and yet we still have this image of the municipal police as very corrupt and very poorly trained in police forces. And so the question is, well, if these policies are in place, and Dan, if you're telling me that things aren't as bad as we think they are, then well, gosh, why aren't these things working better? And in some cases, it is problems of policy design. The policies just simply are not designed well, and that's certainly the case with accountability mechanisms. They're not made to work right. In a lot of other cases, it has to do more with problems of implementation. And this can be, I kind of think of these as problems of goodwill and problems of not so goodwill. And so, merit-based promotion has not been implemented successfully because, well, people don't want it to be implemented successfully. Other things like the education, it comes down to, well, we need police on the streets, and we really can't pull them out of service to as much as we'd like to improve their education levels and send them to high school and get them technical degrees and college degrees and whatnot. Vetting, this is a massive program on a massive scope, over 100,000 tests. I mean, you can imagine the problems of implementation that one would have in carrying out some kind of program along those lines. But the real clincher for me is really problems of institutionalization, problems of continuity between administrations, where there's a real start and stop, 2 steps forward, 1 step back process of reform And you can see these in a lot of areas: procedures, selection criteria, training, equipment. One administration comes in and says, we're really going to focus on quality, we're going to improve selection criteria, we're going to improve training, we're not going to build the size of our police force, we're going to focus on quality. Next administration comes in and says the previous administration left you citizens just abandoned. There's no police, they didn't increase the size of the police force. I'm gonna fix this, and I'm going to send more police out on the force, and what ends up happening is they relax the selection criteria, they shorten the training times, they end in-service training so they can put more police on the force. So you get this kind of discourse between quality and quantity, this pendulum that swings back and forth between different administrations. I have here a picture of a DARE police officer. The DARE program is huge in Mexico. In all 4 of my municipalities, they have very strong DARE programs. It's not to say DARE is a great program, but the fascinating thing for me about the DARE program is that it lasts across administrations in all 4 of my research sites. And there could be a variety of reasons why that might be. One of the reasons that I think is important is that the DARE requires a patronato, kind of a board of directors of citizens that are there, that are supporting the program, that are providing money, that are there overseeing things. And so I think that helps ensure continuity in administrations. There's other reasons as well, but that's something of important. Just to give you an example of just how problematic the continuity problem can be, these are 2 police cruisers from Tijuana. Photos taken in 2008. You'll notice they look very different. This is a black cruiser, this is a white cruiser. This has one emblem, this has an entirely different emblem. Well, why might that be? Well, it has to do with the changes in administration. So the color of blue happens to be the color of the PAN party. So when PRI administrations come in, they don't really like sending police out in the color of blue, so they incentives to change things. So the police was changed to black, which was not sold as a political thing, and this was sold as, this is great, we're recreating the police force. The police has been bad in Tijuana, and we are going to we're going to recreate the police force, and the police force is not going to look at all like it used to look. And so it's sold in this kind of way. And this is a fairly innocuous example, but it shows the lack of continuity that oftentimes exists in things as simple as what the police look like. More importantly, it has real impacts on policy. So these are procedures. This is Mexicali. And this is fairly typical. You have 4 different administrations here, and each administration has a different policy in place regarding procedures. One administration comes in and gets the police ISO 9001 certified. So this is ISO 9001, International Standards Organization. You develop procedures and you certify them by this international body. Great. Next administration comes in of the same party and says, we don't want that, and brings in this kind of Japanese quality control program. Next administration comes in, says we don't want that, and develops kind of an internal mechanism. The next administration comes in and goes for CALEA recognition. Now, this isn't necessarily bad. It's kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because Mexicali was able to get recognition from CALEA faster than any other department because some of these bases had already been laid. But you could certainly imagine that there's probably a more productive way to go about building procedures. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Chihuahua. You have 5 administrations here. You have 2 police chiefs over an 11-year period, which is not very common by any stretch of the imagination. And most importantly, CALEA accreditation started in a priest administration and it finished in a PAN administration. And so that's the kind of continuity that I think is going to be really important moving forward, and where civil society, where people need to be thinking not just, hey, are they doing the right things, but are these the kinds of things that are going to last into the next administration, and what are the strategies in place to help them last in the next administration? So the big question for me is, can civil society fill this role? Can civil society be the force that promotes continuity across administrations? And if it can, in theory, like it has been in the DARE program, is civil society really prepared to play this role? And then the other big question that kind of arises has to do more with the corruption issues. And so corruption has been left as the last thing. We're going to improve salaries, we're going to improve education, we're going to improve lots of things, but that corruption issue, that's a tough one. And so it's kind of being sequentially left as the last thing. And maybe that's okay. That's the kind of the question I have. There's a sequencing to reform. Maybe corruption has to come last. But maybe corruption really needs to come first in order to have everything fall into place after that. So those are the 2 kind of key questions I have moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. Why don't we go to Juan?
Can we switch?
Yes, absolutely. Let me close this out.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation. I will skip some slides as my presentation is really long, so I will try to, in the interest of time and having a longer discussion, I will just try to skip some slides, and so many things I want to say, they have already been addressed by Daniel, so I'll try to keep it short. I have three key areas in my presentation. The first one is related to Mexico's current strategy to combat organized crime, basically drug dealing. The second one is related to the need to reform local policing in Mexico. And the third one relates more to good practices and what I have found through my research in local policing. Well, first of all, here are 3 points that I think summarize Mexico's current federal strategy to combat organized crime. There has been a sort of open season on drug dealers since Calderon arrived to power in the year 2006. This means there has been a frontal, all-out attack on cartels, criminal organizations dealing with principally narcotics. And this has been like the key focus of the policy. There has been little done in terms of financial intelligence and other elements that are key to combat organized crime. And it has just been a frontal attack in terms of bringing the military out on the street. There have been 2 main strategies for militarization. The first one is more notorious and it's more visible in the media, that has to do with military elements participating in joint operations with federal police officers. The second one is more invisible and has to do with the participation of military elements as mid-ranks and high-rank officers in law enforcement bodies, locally, at state level, and at federal level. And that one is more long-term, and it's even more dangerous, as it's actually militarizing the way law enforcement is being undertaken in Mexico. And it's an issue that hasn't been sufficiently analyzed, and that it's silently advancing in Mexico. This has to do with the second point that is mentioned here, the allocation of temporary powers, what are assumed to be temporary powers to the military in terms of law enforcement and public security. There is no clear timeline in relation to when are we expecting the military to get out of the streets. All my Southern American friends, colleagues, they are telling me it's very dangerous to get the military out of the barracks. And once they're out, it's very hard to get them back into the barracks. That's an experience we don't have in our recent history in Mexico. So I think we're really not taking seriously as seriously as we should this problem. And we also don't have an exit strategy. What will happen once we take the military out of the streets? Of course, we have a lot of problems regarding policing and the training and capacities of our law enforcement officers. But what will happen once we take the military out of the streets? They will have to go back to the barracks some days. We also have a massive media campaign that is going along with this overall strategy to combat organized crime. It's very most based on seizures, on capturing drug cartel leaders, but it's very much based on this, which has little impact actually on the market, on the drug market. If they capture a drug leader, there will be another succeeding this person. If they make big seizures, either of drug or of money, they will adjust the price in the market. It won't seriously affect the market, the drug market. It's finally a business, so they will find a way to sort it out. And there is a big consumption, so it will keep going. So these measures are not being actually effective on the drug market, and there is a big lack in terms of reducing the financial incentives and getting a serious job done in terms of intelligence, financial intelligence, and money laundering. There are 3 sorts of reforms undertaken currently in terms of police reform. The reforms undertaken by the legislative, they have been basically reforms oriented towards making our criminal laws more tough on offenders. There are a number of reforms undertaken by the judiciary, which is the judiciary is considerably lagging back in comparison to the other two powers in Mexico. But, however, under Article 97 of our Constitution, they are starting to undertake a fact-finding role they can take regarding human rights violations. And, well, it's a very limited role because what comes out of these investigations is a non-binding resolution, which is not a ruling. And even with this non-binding resolution, the judiciary has been very shy and very inactive in this regard. So there still has much to be done about the judiciary. We haven't had a warrant court in Mexico that has been able to curb police abuse. So there still has to be much done from the judiciary side in terms of rulings, case law, to actually curb irregularities and police abuse. Daniel was talking about corruption as this last step maybe of police reform. There is a lot that can be done from the judiciary in terms of curbing and actually acting against corruption and impunity in Mexico, but this has been very slow, a rather slow process. And finally, where we have much more action, which is the reforms promoted by the executive. However, there is no coherent, no cross-cutting package of reforms so far. Well, in terms of the reforms undertaken by the executive, we could start by saying that there was an initial drive to federate, to merge the federal police bodies in Mexico. This was a very sad failure from the current head of the Federal Public Security Department. He initially tried to merge what was the AFI, the Federal Investigation Bureau, its equivalent, and the federal police, the custom police, and the immigration police. He failed to do this due to different technical and political problems, and he has anyway invested a large amount of earmarked resources for police reform only to these bodies. These bodies, the federal police bodies, represent roughly 4% of Mexican police officers, of the total population of police officers, and most of the resources we are devoting, Mexico is devoting to police reform, is concentrated on only this 4% of the whole law enforcement officer population. And it's actually the sector that has less contact with citizens. And the 96% of the police bodies, which are municipal or state police bodies, they receive a much smaller amount. As Daniel was saying, they receive funds from Subsemun, which are earmarked funds that go as transfers from the federation to the municipalities. But still, it's very limited compared to what the federal police bodies are currently receiving. And finally, it's also important to find out here in this graph what I was telling you, that it's not even 4% what the federal police represents in terms of our general police force. So it's a very limited effort, the one that is going, let's say, top down. In relation to what we're having now, the armed forces undertaking public security roles, I here identify 4 issues that are quite problematic in addition to what Daniel has already pointed out. The first one is related to the use of force. Of course, law enforcement officers are at least initially trained to use force to prevent crime. However, the armed forces, they are trained to eliminate enemies. So whenever they go out on the streets, they're not used to do policing. They are looking for enemies and they're looking to eliminate them. So it's a rather different logic in terms of the use of force. There is also an issue regarding accountability. Of course, our police officers are not the most accountable in the world, but when we talk about the military, they're even less accountable. They within their logic, they don't have to be accountable on what they're doing. They're just eliminating an enemy. There is also a big problem regarding the relations between security agent and the community. If we already have a lot of tension between police officers and the communities, this tension is even tougher when we talk about the military and the communities in terms of human rights abuses. And in addition, there is also a wrongful interpretation of civilian-military relationships in a time of peace, of what should be considered peacetime in Mexico. The military shouldn't be out on the street so actively if we don't have an armed conflict going on. I have some graphs here. I will just, I'll just stop here at the first one, and I'll go very fast with the others because I have very little time. It's just the likelihood to bribe a police officer in Latin America. We have Mexico here on top of the rest of Latin American countries. And this is a survey made by Latino Barometro in 2004. They didn't repeat the question in more recent surveys. It's sadly the highest likelihood. It's 65%. So, yeah, it speaks by itself on how we should think the urgency to reform the police in Mexico. Here we have the incidence of ill treatment based on a survey in Mexico City that more than 0.5% of the persons who have contact with law enforcement officers report some sort of ill treatment. Here are some information regarding how they are ill treated. I would like to stop here to say that there is no one-size-fits-all police reform effort for law enforcement bodies in Mexico. The federal government is proposing a number of initiatives to reform local police bodies, but of course we have to think very carefully on the different jurisdiction and the different roles they have in terms of whether there's federal, state, municipal police bodies, the roles they have, whether they are dealing with prevention or investigation, the different tasks they perform, if they are desk officers or if they are out on the street. The regional approach, we have a very sharp north-south divide. In my research, I haven't been able to find a municipality that qualifies for good practice in southern Mexico. For this, I mean a municipality that has had a sound police reform effort that lasts at least for 2 current municipal administrations, that has an impact on the normative framework, on the bylaws, on the municipal bylaws, and that is also lasting more than 2 municipal administrations. That is not that there are no setbacks. Municipal administrations last only 3 years in Mexico, and there is no re-election. So this is a very serious challenge in terms of the continuity of local police reform efforts. And in addition, I haven't found significant accountability efforts from police departments in southern Mexico. So it's been challenging to identify this situation. I also present here some minimal benchmarks of what I consider effective local police reform in Mexico. The first one is dealing with the issue of the recruitment process. The recruitment process varies very much from one body to another, but there is a need to improve first the policies and then the practice regarding recruitment. As Daniel has mentioned, there have been some improvements in a number of departments in terms of the education requirements for being a police officer, but they're still very limited. They also need a more comprehensive training. The training has also been very much militarized in Mexico, so there needs to be more emphasis on human rights and use of force training. They need to improve the accountability procedures. They need to improve the way their internal and external controls work. A very good example in this regard happened in Querétaro, and I think Edgar will have an opportunity to deal more with this. And it's very important what they have done in Querétaro in terms of their Department for Internal Controls and also their Council for Honor and Justice. So I think that's a crucial step. And in addition to this, the external controls, how the ombudsman system is actually working as a watchdog for police abuse, how civil society organizations are dealing with the issue. To improve street-level supervision of police officers and integrity testing. Street-level supervision is actually the largest challenge in any police body around the world, but in Mexico is particularly critical. We have very little studies of police routine and what the officers are actually doing on the street. So a lot of these reforms, even if they are good in paper, it's very hard to follow how the mid-ranks are actually supervising the officers on the street. There's also a big issue dealing with the generation, systematization, and effective use of statistical information. There's a federal effort to create Plataforma Mexico, which is a big database dealing with crime and institutional performance indicators that is being implemented at the federal level. But there is a huge problem with access to information from this platform, and there is also a problem of a technological divide, and many law enforcement, local law enforcement agencies don't have the technological requirements to access this information. And finally, there is an important element of civilian oversight of law enforcement. I think in this regard, there is much to learn from other countries. Here in the US, you have three very clear models of civilian oversight: the auditor model, the sort of ombudsman model, and the civilian review complaint board that are distributed in different parts of the country. We still don't have formal civilian oversight of law enforcement in Mexico, so it's something we still need to develop. I will just go very fast because I'm told I have to cut my presentation. Well, these are what I have identified as good practice examples in Mexico. They are very rare, but still it's worth mentioning them. The first one has to do with the Federal District Police Force, the Secretaría de Seguridad Pública del Distrito Federal, which is the largest police force in Latin America by itself, the largest local police force in Latin America. It's about 80,000 police officers working for this police body. They have started a citizen protection unit program, which is actually covering half of Mexico City's police. Of course, it has a lot of flaws, and it was very disappointing to see that one of these units was participating a year and a half ago in the repression of a youth group in Mexico City that were peacefully hanging out in a disco. And there were about 6 persons dead and a police officer dead as a result of this wrongful operation. And it was very disappointing to see that one of these elements of the reformed police force were involved in this tragic incident. So it's still a work in progress. I won't talk about Querétaro because Edgar is here. Naucalpan improved very much its accountability mechanisms and generated a department to do crime mapping that really changed the way they do street policing. They also invested a lot in terms of improving the relations with the community. They entered the DARE program, which I know it's a limited program, but still helped them a lot in terms of improving their relationship with the schools and communities. They also have trained very much their officers. They got collaboration from Canada, from Chile, from different countries to improve their training. And they have really, they had a program that lasted for almost 3 administrations, which is quite remarkable as well. Chihuahua is the most far-reaching program I have known in Mexico. The municipal police body in Chihuahua, you may ask yourselves, why, if Chihuahua is so violent, why is it quoted as a best practice? I'm referring to the municipal police body in Chihuahua. Chihuahua used to be not an extremely violent city until a year and a half ago. This has changed very much lately. But they had the opportunity, having such low crime rates in those years, to experiment with models to approach citizens, to do community policing, to improve the way they actually do their work. There are very good models of intelligent-led policing going on in Chihuahua, which are very remarkable. And of course, they got the CALIA accreditation, which is the first Latin American local police body that is getting this accreditation. And finally, the Guadalajara Public Security Department, which it's a reform that has been very much accompanied by a citizen oversight body that has a strong say on what is going on within the department. All these projects are jeopardized currently by political changes. That's one of the limitations. Sadly, municipal police reform in Mexico is so much limited by political changes, and many of these experiences, there is a different political party, PRI, that has been winning locally on these municipalities, and of course there is no. I cannot say that these programs will continue at the current state they are, but still they are good practice, and there is a lot to learn from them, and there is a high potential of multiplying these experiences in Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Move down. Yeah, I guess so. We should move the name tags too.
Well, hello. Just let me start by saying that I'm going to talk just about the local police reform. I'm not going to address the federal police reform, because even both are linked and have a lot of links between them. They are separate processes with different funding and different strategies. And before I start, and of course, I'm going to say everything from my experience in Querétaro, so it's going to be the local perspective of what's been going on. And I would like to stress that all these police problems that had been addressed by Juan and Daniel are not exclusively police problems. And it's important to know that, and it's important to have this thing present, because those are problems, the long-term policy, the corruption issue, the continuity issue, are I would say, problems of the whole political system. It's something we are suffering not just in the police or the public safety sector, but it's something across government sectors and across municipal, state, and federal levels of government. Of course, with different levels, but still a problem in the whole political system and in many other aspects of Mexican society at large. And this is not to say that there's nothing to do to reform police, that the task is so huge that we should forget about it. There's a lot to do, and actually I will argue that there has been a lot done in the recent years. And just, I'm going to give you I'm going to start by talking about this starting point for Querétaro Police. 20 years ago, there was no training requirement. 15 years ago, elementary school was the requirement, and yet a lot of people without any education will manage to get into the force. 5 years ago, we practically didn't have any computer system. 4 years ago, there was no written policy or procedures. And 2 years ago, we didn't have a disciplinary process, formal disciplinary process for police misconduct. None of this, or most of this, is unthinkable today in any large police department in Mexico. And after 15 years of federal programs to improve policing in Mexico, we also have some achievements, like a national communication network. Sorry, I'm losing. Yeah, sorry. I'm just going to say, despite all these achievements and changes that have been happening in the last 10 years, well, everyone will agree that the results seems at least very poor. And especially when we look at the challenges that the country is facing and the sector is facing, and when we continue to see many police officers involved in corruption and crime. So it doesn't look that all these achievements have really changed the way policing is done in Mexico. And furthermore, these changes have had little or not impact at all in the relations between the community and the police, and the perception that the citizens has about police. But let me go through some of the efforts that we have done and try to identify some of the weaknesses, so we can try to understand what has gone wrong and what are the opportunities there. And I will start with the federal efforts, and those made through the national public safety system. And those are some of the programs, I will call them programs, that have been in place for 15 years at least, 95. One is the National Communication Network with very good achievements. We have a state-of-the-art radio communication system that allows for joint operations and multiple jurisdictions to being able to communicate through the same radio system. We have a very extensive data network, very secure and extensive data network. On another program, we have national databases for police registries. We have a national database for stolen vehicles. And, of course, we have an emergency phone number that was not there 15 years ago. But there was no emergency phone number, and now almost every large city, and I would say most of the population in Mexico has access to this service, with a lot of room for improvement, but at least there's this kind of service. Equipment and infrastructure has also improved very much. I would say, and again, I'm talking from Querétaro perspective, but about firearms, patrol cars, buildings, computers. We really have improved too much in all these areas. And I will try to focus on this last one, professionalization, and three of their main objectives: to establish what is called civil service, to improve training, and to evaluate or vet. Now it has changed recently to the vetting strategy. Well, in this regard, I just would like to say very fast, because the time is brief. Sorry, I just missed my note here. Yeah, well, in the 15 years that the program has been running, the professionalization program, we have also have very remarkable achievements, like the new regional police academies that have increased the offered and the actually training hours of specialized training for police officers in Mexico. We have also agreed on a national minimum requirements for basic training for police officers, even though not all police departments, especially the small ones, have really adopted it in all the country. But at the same time, on the problems, I would add that there's little planning on who has to receive this training and what kind of training, specialized training, has to be received. And this is due to the other program that is civil service that I would say has failed to be established. It has been there for a while. We actually have developed national standards for most of the procedures for the civil service: recruitment, training, on-the-job training, disciplinary process, promotions. But these standards have not been really implemented. Some states have passed legislation. Querétaro has passed legislation to implement these standards in these processes, but the truth is that most of the municipal police department has not yet install or implement these changes and these standards. For the third one there, the evaluation, there's also, I would say, a good effort that now is being improved, and of course it has a lot of challenges, but there are standards, very basic standards of what to be evaluated on a regular basis for every police officer in the country. And I will say that what haven't worked in all these efforts is that there's the lack of indicators of success. Most of the indicators used in the programs are process indicators, that hours of training, police officers trained, but there's nothing about the results or the impact that we are looking at. lack of incentives so far, until very recently, the amount of the money that the federal, the FASP, the federal fund for supporting local police reform, didn't change really with the results that every state delivers. And this can easily be understood since there are no indicators of results. There are more how many inmates you have in your prisons. Those were the criteria. There's also lack of transparency and accountability. It's, and this is, I would say, a lot of the guilt here is on the state and the local part because they don't want to be very clear about what's happening and how effective they have been doing all this. And I will add that this may be also part of the on the federal side because the design of all these programs are not very inclusive and they have not been developed with the participation or strong participation from local authorities. And there's also a lack of local needs, and I will refer to this at the end of the presentation if I still have time. Well, now I'm going to briefly talk about some things happening in Querétaro. Wages have almost tripled in a 10-year period, in an 11-year period. Education required now for entry the police force is high school, and it's a one-year training. There's a legal requirement of university degree for all the top ranks on the state police. There's an on-the-job training on regular basis. As I said, we have good equipment in Querétaro, and accountability and institutional learning system. We have been working, or they have been working in this lately, and I would say this is one of the most successful efforts made so far, because even though it has, and here it has some of the elements that everyone has been working in, like a centralized compliant processing center where all complaints from citizens and from different sources come into one place. Then we have an internal first unit with composed mostly of lawyers who will go through all these complaints and what will assure the citizens a very clear and transparent process for the investigation and for the processing of the complaint, and they will use the technology that it's in place, like GPS, like on-patrol cameras, like the police report file system, and all this technology to try to do a good investigation. Then we have this disciplinary council where there are police officers elected by the rest of the police force participating, and some citizens overlooking at doing oversight of the whole process. But the most important thing I would say is the system is designed also with what we call the Professional Standards Committee, and this is meant to approach the problem not incident by incident, but trying to understand what's behind those incidents and trying to change the system as it works to help it work better. What I mean is this committee can change policy, can change procedures, can improve training, can change the training curricula, so we give this a more systematic approach. Of course, there are things that are not working. The system was designed also to have an early warning system that will detect or problems with specific police officers and try to address them before anything else happens. The Civil Service Commission is not working as it should be. As I said, legislation is in place, but we still haven't implemented all the procedures. They are much, much better than what they used to be, but they're still not working especially because we don't have developed a good performance evaluation, and so the promotions still not working at what one will expect it. And deployment, and by this I mean sending police officers to the street to very specific, with very specific objectives, still something not working very well. Most departments in Querétaro still have the same number of police officers at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday when nothing is happening, and a Friday at midnight when things are getting bad. They still have the same number of police officers. There's no much intelligence in how this work, and well, I'll move forward. I'm going to mention this one very, very fast. We also have a program in Querétaro that I think is having a lot of impact, and is intended to evaluate the police as an institution and not just the police officers. It's a sort of accreditation program like the CALIA one. It has a set of 60 standards or more. It has a commission with people from the public, from other state agencies as the Human Rights Commission and the Government Information Agency, and people from different municipalities. And the funding, the federal funding and the state funds are tied to results in this particular program. And we also have a technical assistance office to provide tools and help to municipals. Well, the opportunities. I would say that there's a need for a more inclusive design process. The problems with the indicator selection and design, the problems with the formulas for funding. I guess if we have a more inclusive design process with the local authorities and with civil society, these problems might be addressed. And then a federal reform with a local perspective. What I mean with this, much of the efforts done are made with the federal needs in mind. When they design Plataforma Mexico, the system, a lot of it's a very, very useful system for everyone, because we have been able to gather information for intelligence and to improve police work at all levels, but is designed from the federal perspective. So a lot of needs of local police agencies are not incorporated on the system. So then there are some municipal or state police not willing to use that system because they have another one that has all the features they need, and there's a problem there. Of course, there are a lot of police departments that they didn't even have systems, so this is good news for them. But for those having work done, they will be looking for something like to standards on how to share information more than having just one system in place. Police governance, a big issue, and I guess a big opportunity for continuity. There's a lot of discretional powers on the leadership of police and public safety department at state and municipal level to change policy from one year to another, and there's no like these commissions on the states that has the power to approve change of policy, even though the elected official still the main it's in command of the operational. And accountability and transparency must be one of the issues to be addressed, and targeting. Most of the efforts now have target the individual police officer. Let's train it. Let's do the vetting to see that these are trusted. But there's little done to improve police management practices at the general. And finally, a more comprehensive agenda. And by that, I mean we have the history of the U.S. policing, and that could be used for the purpose of Mexico. And by that, I mean U.S. Went through a big reform to make a professional police service. And then after some years and after some problems, and they realized that they needed a more comprehensive reform that included community policing, community relations, human rights. And I think in Mexico we cannot afford to spend 100 years to reform the police and make it professional, and then realize that professional, as we understand it, is not enough, and we have to address these other issues. So far, the federal initiatives have focused just in the training, just in the equipment, but there's no too much attention to accountability, transparency, community relations, and human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edgar. Thanks to all three of you for very interesting and informative presentations, and I apologize for having to cut you off. There's a lot more to say on this issue, and I think particularly showing that in spite of all the kind of negative publicity on police in Mexico, there's a lot of really important measures going on, particularly at the state and local level, on good practices and others that can certainly be built on. Before we open this up to more questions and answers, I did want to invite David Shirk, who's a visiting fellow this year at the Mexico Institute. Eric had presented him earlier from the Transborder Institute in San Diego, who has worked a lot on police reform issues as well, and is actually co-editing a book that should be out next month, being co-edited by Robert Donnelly here of the Mexico Institute on Police and Public Security in Mexico. So, David, if you have any comments as well, thank you.
I do, and I'll try to be really brief because this is obviously a fantastic discussion, and I congratulate the panelists on their research, their work, and their excellent presentations. I have really just three comments. First of all, is the importance of keeping perspective, particularly with the media reports and so forth. I do think that, as the presentations illustrate today, there's cause for cautious optimism about where police reform is headed in Mexico. And I say that because I take a long-term view. I think it's always easier to be optimistic when you look at the long run because, as Keynes says, we're all dead, but also because it is, I think, quite remarkable the progress that has been made in other cases. For example, in the U.S. experience, as Edgar just mentioned, and actually much shorter than in 100 years, but rather if you think in the last 40 years, how much progress has been made in the United States since Gideon, 45 years, Gideon versus Wainwright, the Miranda versus Arizona case, 1968, we got 911, you now have 066. In 1972, the Knapp Commission and Serpico and the development of effective internal investigations in the United States. All that, despite our relatively short memory as a country, all those things are relatively new for the United States, and those elements of due process it's very exciting to see those elements of due process developing in Mexico. That said, the second point is that there are some concerns. One concern is the concentration of police powers that we've seen at the federal level, particularly this unification of police essentially concentrates several important police agencies under SSP, the Secretary of Public Security. And one question I have or concern is how much is that a problem? Are we putting all of our eggs in one basket? Is that something that could be manipulated or used as we create a central hierarchical model for crime control in both senses of the meaning at the federal level? A second and related concern is the impending return of the PRI to the presidency. Now that we've centralized control of police at the federal level and we're inviting the old guard back into power, or likely to in 2012, what does that mean? Lastly, I think a major concern that Juan mentions is the militarization of public security, and not only military deployment, but also the staffing of police agencies with military personnel. And we see this very strongly not only at the federal level, but at the local level as well, where police chiefs have been appointed. And I would invite comment on that concern. The last point is again returning to the optimistic side. On the when you identify the mechanisms and the solutions to police reform, many of the things, for example, Daniel mentioned, institutional reform, things like perhaps inviting re-election at the municipal level, which might provide a certain degree of continuity. Something that seemed impossible maybe 10, 20 years ago might happen in the next 10 to 20 years. civilian review boards, which Edgar mentioned, very important, and the rules for civilian review boards at the municipal level vary very widely. Some overlap different administrations. Some are directly appointed by the mayor, and they represent his cronies. So seeing some progress in the development of these boards, I think, is going to be very important. And lastly, again, returning to the U.S. experience, one of the things that was transformative for law enforcement in the United States, particularly local law enforcement, was the Safe Streets Act of 1968, which created the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration and a whole variety of agencies, including the NIJ, that have dramatically advanced the role of the professionalization of police in the United States, and that's why things like Subsemun, which Daniel mentioned, actually several of you have mentioned, are so important. The concern I have there is, can those kinds of investments, large investments in education, in criminology, etc., can those be sustained over the long term? But again, congratulations on fantastic presentations.
Thank you, David. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on some of his questions, and we can go to.
Well, I just want to comment on the initiative to unified police command, as has been said, and also some people have suggest that Mexico should move for a national police, meaning disappearing local policing, which looks very difficult, but some people have talked about. And I would like just to comment very briefly that, again, when you read U.S. history on police, and when the community policing initiatives start to develop, you could see that even though in the U.S. you have detectives and preventive police under the same department, the assessment was always the same. There's no communication between them. So what I'm worried about is that we just think that by having two different police functions under one head will guarantee communication and information sharing when we can see what happened here in the U.S. So I think that, again, the assessment, the diagnosis is not well done. There's a problem of communications. Having just one head might be the solution, but it is not necessarily the solution, and it is not necessarily the only solution, and there might be another options more effective. So just want to say that. And the other thing that I have to comment regarding these other people that has suggested a national police force is that Mexico is very diverse, and the circumstances in the north, in the south, even in Querétaro City with the rural part of the state are so different that I will really say that I don't believe that the national police will address all these local needs. And again, I think that this is, when people suggest this, is just seen from the federal perspective. Okay, we have this drug-related violence and problem, and, well, if we had a national police, we might be able to face it more efficiently. But they forget about all the local issues, the local policing needs and the community needs, that the petty crime, the traffic issues that must be addressed by a police that is in contact with the community. So, and being a federation, and I think there's a great opportunity there to try different models and to learn from each other. But again, this requires someone. And I know Juan is doing it, and Daniel is doing research, and a lot of people is doing research. Not a lot of people, but there's research there of what's working and what's not working. But there's no a systematic national permanent effort to document this and to share information, to make things change at the local level. And this, I think, is a great opportunity. We are a federal country, and instead of seeing this as a problem, we should see it as a great opportunity. That's all.
Well, I would just like to address the issue of the concentration of powers in the Federal Security Department. That hasn't so far been accomplished. Let's say round one was lost. The Secretary for Public Security, he tried to merge AFI and the Federal Police, and he couldn't make it for two reasons. One of them was political, that he had a problem with the former attorney, General Attorney. Now the General Attorney is out of the way, so of course he will try to do something, and he's very much attached to AFI because he himself created AFI, so he wants to get it under his power again. I mean, that's on his agenda very clearly. But there is a technical problem, and there is a governance problem as well in relation to whether AFI would really like to be merged with the federal police, and that was the other consideration why it didn't happen. Because there are a lot of problems in the relationship between these two police bodies, and also a technical problem regarding how they will be administered under the Public Security Department. For this technical problem, there is a legislative initiative that goes very much beyond what is being proposed by the head of the Public Security Department, and it actually wants to amend the 115th article of our Constitution and to disappear completely municipal police bodies, and to make a huge change in our federal pact and to create a national police, which was an initial idea posed by the Fox administration back in 2004, which didn't go anyway. But still, it's on the agenda, and there are these dark forces trying to disappear our municipal police bodies. And I agree that local policing is absolutely necessary, not only because they respond to different necessities from the ground, from a bottom-up approach, and have better knowledge of what is going on at grassroots level, but also because we are a federation, and if we are scared by 2,000 police bodies, you have here over 18,000 police bodies, and you have, I would say, a rather efficient local policing system. And I think we can learn a lot about here or Brazil or how other federations have managed to deal with these issues instead of thinking of disappearing them all. The other issue, the PRI might be back to take the presidency in 2012, but they are already taking a lot of local power after this year's election, and that is what is jeopardizing police reforms locally. All my best case study, local case study cases are now being jeopardized because PRI won at the local level. And there is a lot of uncertainty of whether any of my best examples will continue. It's so short-lived and it's so terrible that there is so little in terms of continuity. That I think that the risk of PRI in 2012 it's terrible, but what we have now is also very worrying.
Well, thank you. We have about 5-10 minutes for questions. So why don't we open up just one round of questions? Maybe take 3 or 4. Please identify yourself, and then we got Diane, and then Andrew. So.
Diana Negroponte from the Brookings Institution. 2 quick questions. Daniel Savat, for you, the role of the police chief. Is this the political figure that we have known in the United States, or do you have police chiefs who are anonymous technicians? Second question, the relationship between the police and the Fiscalia in the preparation of the reports and the preservation of evidence such that the prosecution has a sustainable case to bring before the courts.
Okay, and then you, sir, in the back, and then Andrew.
Raymond Rivera with the Department of Justice International Criminal Investigative Training Assistance Program. Comment for the overall panel. When you reported in reference to the efforts made on internal affairs reform. I've noticed that there was no mention of reform in inspections and control. That was another area that our programs we focus on as a mechanism to provide oversight over the police managers and supervisors. Again, if you have good internal affairs procedures and implementation, you can get the bad actors, the bad street cops. But how do you address, unless you have a systematic process of looking of addressing bad actions, inefficiencies, or high-level corruption within supervisors and managers? And I just noticed that was not addressed at all by the panel, but you allude to it in the fact that there is not a mechanism for good supervision and management oversight.
Here and then close with Andrew.
B. Cuartas from El Paso Community College. I just came from Juarez a couple of weeks ago, and there were over 3,000 people dead starting 2008, but that's reported. Now, not reported, there's far more than that. And just last month, 300 were dead. And my question is, what is the incentive for a police officer not to be corrupt? If they have a gun to their head and they are told that they either comply or they will be killed, or any one of the members in their family will be killed. And of course, this has spillover effects into the United States, as we saw. Now the corruption and the organized crime has crossed the border, and they have been killing people from El Paso in Juarez. So my question is, what can be done in order to incentivize and to help police officers not be fearful in Mexico? Because in the United States, if a police officer gets killed, it's a big problem with the law. What happens in Mexico, and what can be done to help police officers be motivated to be accountable and transparent?
Andrew.
Just thank you. I think this is sort of a subtext in all three presentations and what David said as well, but just to throw this out there again, it strikes me that there's two different debates going on. When you talk to people at the federal government in Mexico, it's about organized crime. When you talk to people in the U.S. government, you look at the Merit Initiative, it's about organized crime and it's about national level reforms. When you talk to people at a state and local level in Mexico, it's about reforming the police, but there's rarely a reference to organized crime also, even though that is clearly one element out there. And I'm wondering how you marry those two debates. And I'm not saying it's wrong for the federal government to focus on organized crime. I think there's reasons why that is a federal responsibility and is a priority at this moment. But how do you begin to marry those two? Other than the Subsimun, it's hard to find federal efforts to deal with state and local. And except in certain municipalities and certain states, it's hard to find people willing to talk about the organized crime dimension.
Okay. Who wants to start? Go ahead.
You can start with them. I'm going to try to address some of the issues. I will start with the inspection and control, and I think that's also a very important opportunity area because there's no much being done, generally speaking. And Querétaro, just going back to the example I was talking about, we have done some things. The written policy and procedures and the technology, again, with some lateral controls like communications, like filing police reports, like some supervision, street supervision functions that are tied with the written policies, and a service that is not in place yet that has to audit all the reports and the communications to look for flaws or to look for things that had not been done as they meant to be done. So there are some efforts there. I didn't mention it because it's not very consolidated so far, and I would say it's not happening in any or most of the municipal police agencies in Querétaro, in the state of Querétaro. And regarding your comment, is one of my worries that the betting system in place, because you can go and screen a new police officer and see that this guy is honest, has an honest living, and it's a promising police officer. But then the next day, after approved by the betting system, he has a gun in his head and he might do other things. So the betting system, or the control de confianza effort, I think is very important, as Daniel mentioned it. But I think, or I'm worried that it doesn't have this systematic approach at looking at not just having the right guy, but also protecting these guys with a system. What can be done? It's something I won't answer, and I don't know if you to solve this problem at the national level but at the very local level with the municipal police, I think things might be not that hard. It seems, because organized crime has little to obtain from local police. They can obtain some information on where the police are doing surveillance, and that's the kind of information they are looking for, local police. So I think that if we address this with a systematic approach and make it very difficult, even if they are willing to give information or they are threat to give information, for them to have all the pieces together, then at least the preventive police will be less interesting for organized crime. But I don't have the answer for that. And just about the reforms, there are these two reforms. The one linked to the organized crime that is urgently needed in Mexico, how to address this problem. I'm not trying to say that this is not important and it should be in the national agenda and the federal agenda, because it is also affecting the local reform. When the funding is going to organized crime, when the debate is focusing on organized crime, these other areas are somehow left alone. So it's affecting in several ways. And of course, in those cities with high rates or outbreaks of violence, reform issues related to community policing and seems to be at least not a priority. So it's affecting it, but at the same time, the organized crime is not the problem it is in Ciudad Juárez, in every city and every state. There are problems everywhere, but it's not the same level of problem. And as I said, the local agenda is being affected by this national problem. And I want to be clear on this. I'm not trying to say that we should not be addressing this. It's just that should be more balanced, and both things should be on moving forward. That's all. Thanks.
Well, I would like to briefly address the issue of local police officers into the criminal investigation procedure. I will let, of course, Daniel complete it, but I'd just like to get off my chest a subject that is very disturbing for me, that under the new criminal justice reform that is taking place in Mexico, local police bodies will have a core responsibility of preserving the crime scene, and it's a huge responsibility that's being allocated on these officers, considering the very limited capacities they have in this regard and the very limited training they have so far. And so far, the efforts that have been undertaken in terms of training, they are addressed to the investigative police officers, to the judiciary, but not really to the preventive officers that will have a new role and that are absolutely not prepared to undertake it. I would also like to react on the inspection and control, what can be done. There has something very interesting been done in Chihuahua in terms of incorporating civilians to the review procedures. That has also been done in Querétaro, and it's remarkable and unusual. And I think bringing civilians into the Consejos de Honor y Justicia, these bodies that are responsible for allocating administrative responsibilities for police officers involved in misconduct, I think it really makes a difference in terms of having an external view and breaking this vicious circle of police officers judging police officers. And I think there are good examples of what can be done in this regard. Of course, it's still a very limited approach in Mexico, and it has to be multiplied. Also at the federal level, I think in terms of incentives for police officers not to be corrupt, there is also good practice in Chihuahua that needs to be further regarded and studied. They have not only an early warning, but an early intervention system going on in Chihuahua, which is very interesting in terms of how they follow the patterns of police relation with citizens, of police abuse, of not only individual cases, but also cross-cutting in their corporation. And they were able to identify 2 corrupt officers that were later taken to the PGR, to Mexico's general attorney, to be prosecuted, criminally prosecuted for offenses. And I think this had a huge impact in the police body, and I think this could be an example on how this issue could be tackled. Of course, it's a very sensitive issue because corruption is institutionalized in most Mexican police bodies. So it requires a lot of political willingness to take this first step. But at least this shows that something can be done if there is the right political willingness in place. Finally, related to how to bridge this organized crime and local policing discussions, I think the new federal legislation regarding organized crime is trying to bridge this, maybe not from the bottom-up approach, but still there is, I think our organized crime institutions or mafias or whatever they are much more sophisticated than the Colombian ones in terms that they are so involved in regular crime as well as in what can be labeled as organized crime, that if we think of a comprehensive approach to really eliminate this threat, then they will have to think of local policing as well as federal policing. We don't have to necessarily change the jurisdiction of the different law enforcement bodies, and we don't have to make a complex legislative arrangement for this. We just have to think of a complex problem in terms of the diversity of the activities of these criminal organizations, and how it can be better addressed from bottom up and from top down.
Okay, I'll be really quick. On the police directors, not a professional. These aren't guys that have risen up through the ranks, political appointees, increasingly military appointees. So it's not a professional position, changes with every 3-year administration. So the police directors are often not, there's a lot of on-the-job learning and not necessarily the types of folks that we would want in there. And particularly on the military side, I think it's increasingly popular to just put in a military person, and their main credential is the fact that they were in the military, and there's no sense of, well, were they good? Did they perform very well in the military, and why would we think they would be good ahead of the police? So that would be my comment there. On the reform issue, I can talk about the Baja California experience. They're starting in Mexicali. All the municipal police forces do go through an 80-hour course preparing them for the change to judicial reform, so I think that is a very positive thing, and I think it's good that their roles are expanding. The ability to secure a crime scene, I think, is something that is common sense. That's a police job. That's what these guys should be doing. Previously, if it was raining, they would stand there and watch evidence be washed away because they didn't have the the ability to be involved in securing the crime scene properly. So I view those things as very good. If we want a professional police force, then they have to do things that professional police do. On the protecting or on the bullet of the bribe kind of thing, obviously it's not anything that's going away. It has enormous explanatory power. If I were in the same shoes, I would do the exact same thing, and I think all of us would. It seems like there are opportunities to address the problem if there were. So communications lines can be secured. I mean, right now organized crime is listening on scanners that they buy for a couple $100 at Target. So communications can be secured better. Police officers that are assassinated are not investigated, and that's pretty much across the board. In Baja California, they just had some commitment to start investigating police officers that are killed, and there's plenty of ballistic evidence that seems to link all the guns that have been. It's the same people killing all the police in Baja California, at least. So that in theory, there could be good investigations. We know the modus operandi. The police officers are given a cell phone, and they said, we'll call you. It seems like if they're walking around with lots of cell phones, there would be some. I don't mean to belittle the point. It's obviously the fundamental issue, but it seems like there's lots of ways that things could be done if there was the will and ability to overcome them. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you all again for this excellent presentations. Thank you for the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center for co-hosting again with WOLA and LOG, and thanks to all of you for coming. So.